Alex right here. Today I wanted to show you my process of painting a landscape. I always start with a sketch to guide me, and that way it becomes easier to think of the shapes as big, separate objects, and I can concentrate better on their relationships. Here I start blocking in with a Princeton Bristle No. 6 Bright. And the colors I'm using are Titanium White, Ultramarine Blue, Burnt Umber, Yellow Ochre, Cadmium Yellow Pale, Oxide of Chromium, Magenta, and Phthalo Green. For the sky, I'm using a combination of Titanium White, Ultramarine Blue, a touch of Burnt Umber, and a touch of Magenta. The magenta is added for a certain kind of warmth, and you can also add cerulean blue or cobalt blue, just a tiny bit of course. And by the way, this is a study I'm making of a painting painted by Andrew Tischler, a great master in my opinion. I find it very educational to study from paintings of great skilled painters. I've somewhat started to shape my clouds with my sky color, and for my clouds that I will go into in a second, I'm using Titanium White and a touch of Ultramarine Blue with a touch of Burnt Umber for the shadowy parts of my cloud. A combination of ultramarine blue, titanium white, and burnt umber can give a very nice grayish color. And as you can see, with a flat brush like this and this size of painting, I can color the sky quite quickly. As I start to add more titanium white to highlight some of the clouds, I make sure I go back and I don't leave any hard edges that may distract from the painting. From the rest of the painting, because as you come forward, as you come closer to the observer, you'll add more and more details, and therefore, if you add your details too soon in the painting, you will lose on the atmospheric depth you may have created if you had reserved all your details for the foreground. Here I'm starting to block in the mountain, and some areas of the mountain will be covered by snow. And before continuing with the mountains, I decided to add some more shadows to the clouds. For the mountains, I'm using a combination of titanium white, a little bit more ultramarine blue than we used for the skies, and a little bit more burnt umber, but not as much as I would use for the middle ground. Still, preserving that atmospheric depth is of importance, and a touch of magenta to bring up the saturation and bring the mountains a little bit more forward. Creating some diversity with your brush strokes is important during the blocking stage, because later on, throughout the detail stage, you will recognize those separate brush strokes that you've led on before. And the diversity of your brush strokes will add to the illusion of detail. The parts that I'm leaving out right now are going to be the parts that are covered with snow. So there is no need to unnecessarily cover it all up with a dark tone and then fight it with the whites you're gonna add on to. And the snow that I'm adding right now is not pure white, as you can see, because if I went pure white, I wouldn't be able to add any highlight onto my snow-covered areas, because I would be as bright as I could go right from the start, and I do not want that. Since it is partly cloudy, the sun will come through the clouds and it will hit a spot on the mountain that will light up the snow, and at that point I will only use titanium white. Now it's time to soften the transition between the snow and the dark areas of the mountain. By adding a little bit more magenta and a little bit more ultramarine blue, you get this bluish tone that fits great as a mid-value. And again, I try to avoid too harsh lines to refrain from being distracting. And about this stage, I'm done with blocking in my mountain. I will come back later to add some titanium white highlights as detail. And as I get to the mid-range, I gradually add more yellow to bring them forward. For this part I'm using ultramarine blue, yellow ochre, and a little bit of burnt umber. And again, I'm trying to keep my brush strokes as diverse as I can. And for the lighter parts where the light hits these trees, I'm adding a little bit more yellow ochre. Now, unfortunately at this point my battery died, but I decided to do it all over again and start a new painting because I had finished this one and I couldn't record it. So this was the blocking of the first painting, and now I'm going to continue with the new video and see how this one turns out. Let's continue a step ahead. So as you can see, the dimensions are a little different from the first one, because the first one was a piece of canvas I got from my rolled canvas and it wasn't stretched, but this one is stretched and the dimensions are therefore a little different. And I had to change the proportions, like the width of it, of the mountains, and some aspects like the cows maybe a little different. I freehandedly painted them, so that's okay, and I'm mainly concerned about color study. So I'm mainly using the same colors again because I tried to reach a color harmony. I'm using ultramarine blue, yellow ochre, a little bit of burnt umber, and now I'm slowly adding oxide of chromium. This is a green that Winsor & Newton is providing. Because green is such a tricky color, you can't use it all over the canvas, because if you do, you may lose again your atmospheric perspective, and that would be the end of the painting, for me at least. So this is supposed to be a part where the sun hits it stronger, and so I'm going to increase the amount of yellow ochre I'm using. So let's move on to the trees that are the closest. For the shadows, I'm using ultramarine blue, yellow ochre, a tiny bit, and a lot more burnt umber. And if I need a lighter shadow in some areas, I'll just add a touch of oxide of chromium. I know it looks odd, but I'm starting with the shadows and then I'm filling in the lighter tone and then I'm adding the highlights. So the empty parts are going to be the parts that are either the midtones or the highlights. So this is why I'm circling around the tree. And I'm skipping between trees because they more or less have the same tones. The darkest value is between those two trees where they intersect and their leaves probably are pressed together and no light is coming through. And that's where it's going to be the darkest that I have already blocked in. Now I continue with a little lighter color, added a little more yellow ochre for the parts of this left-sided tree that are facing to the mountainside where the light is reflected back to the trees, and therefore the color is going to be a little lighter and not as dark in value as the shadows. So here I'm adding that tiny bush that catches the light beneath that tree. For this color I'm using oxide of chromium, a little bit yellow ochre, and a little bit of titanium white. Now I'm adding my lightest highlight for the block-in stage. And I switch to Winsor & Newton Bristle No. 3. Here I'm using just a touch of oxide of chromium, a touch of yellow ochre, and a lot more titanium white. And the colors that I just mentioned go for all the trees. All the trees have the same highlight color. I only add the slightest bit of yellow ochre to some areas. And since this is the block-in stage, I really try to remind myself that I don't have to go into so much detail, and I try to hold back. And now I'm increasing the difference between the background and the foreground by making the background even lighter than before. And the tree on the right side needs to be a tiny bit brighter than the other two trees on its left side. So I'm adding just a touch more titanium white to all the color mixes that I've done before. So here I'm starting to block in the middle ground, and I needed to block in those cows to see and to understand what I'm doing better. It just helped. And to block in the middle ground, I'm mainly using yellow ochre, titanium white, a touch of oxide of chromium, and a touch of ultramarine blue. I'm using this very light color. And here I'm applying the rule again, that when you come closer to the observer, you increase the saturation of your colors. Here I am adding more oxide of chromium and more yellow ochre. And here, by varying my brush strokes, I'm trying to implicate some details. And as you can see, since I'm much closer to the foreground now, I'm incorporating more yellow ochre and also cadmium yellow pale. And here I have completed the block-in stage and I've moved on to the detail stage. And now I am adding some details to my sky. I'm using a combination of cerulean blue, titanium white, ultramarine blue, and a touch of burnt umber. And for the highlights of the clouds, I'm only using titanium white. Here I'm thinking about the transition between the clouds and the sky, and I'm trying to create a flow. I'm trying to create a look where some clouds are behind the first clouds that we can see, that there are some clouds behind those ones that we can see through and see the sky's color. By adding these saturated colors to the sky, we make sure that the sky comes alive and that it looks more realistic than it did before. Here I've started to add some details to that mountain that is in the front, and I'm using a Vincent Series 11 round number 2, which is a synthetic round brush. I believe that synthetic ones are easier to control when you're adding fine detail. And here again, I'm using ultramarine blue, yellow ochre, titanium white, a little bit more oxide of chromium, a touch of cerulean blue, and a touch of emerald green to give it that bluish look. And yes, this stage requires a lot of patience, but at the end it's gonna be worth it because it just takes your painting to the next level. The observer can see that you've invested in time and you've invested in your energy to create this painting to a level where it looks as real as possible and where it portrays that feeling that you want to convey. But of course, this doesn't mean that you always have to take your painting to that mostly detailed level. You can leave it as a study at the blocking stage, and that is just as fine. It's just basically based on your personal preferences. And with your brush strokes at this stage, with those tiny marks you're making, it can be easy to be swept away by it, but you need to keep an eye on what you're doing, and you don't want to create some distracting lines. You want to keep a harmony within your brush strokes. So here I've started to work on the trees. In my opinion, they're the second most important element of this painting. And by using a combination of titanium white, cadmium yellow pale, and a bit of oxide of chromium, I'm able to create these highlighted leaves of the trees where the sun shines on them. And this brush that I'm using here is a brush that I created myself. Actually, it's a brush from Talent's Art Creation. It was a synthetic number 6, a flat brush, and I trimmed it in such a way that I get some splittered edges. And the tip of that brush enables me to make some marks that are reminiscent of leaves. I believe that at this stage the trick is not to overdo it. You need to hit the right spots where the sun will be shining on those leaves. You don't want to cover the whole tree with your highlights because then you would lose the depth that you may have had if you didn't. And obviously the same technique is applied to all the trees that catch some light. And after adding some definition to the cows, I moved on with adding some details to the foreground, and it is a blast to do it with the trimmed brush. It's just so easy to make some diverse brush strokes. And since I've come really close to the foreground, I'm actually at the foreground now, I'm using more cadmium yellow pale and a little bit more titanium white, and I've also started to incorporate some phthalo green. And phthalo green is such a strong color. I need to warn you, you need to be careful when using it. A little bit goes a long way. If you use too much of it, you may lose some harmony of color. And after completing the grass alongside the stream, I am going to work on the stream now, and I have already blocked in the water, and I've already worked on the stones that are alongside the stream, and now I'm going to add some details. And I'm going to cut some lines across the neck of the cow that will resemble a reflection where the sun is shining on the water. And I must have been so caught up that I didn't realize that some glare was coming off from the light bouncing into the camera's lens, but we'll go back to the proper view in just a few seconds. And all those tiny marks that we're making right now are adding to the realism of our painting. And we want to make sure that we're using darker lines as well as our highlights to give our stream some depth. If we were to use only highlights, it would appear flat. And with those final touches, we are closing in on the end of this painting. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, feel free to subscribe and I'll see you in the next one.